Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we are diving headfirst into a situation that's rapidly heating up. We're talking about the Middle East, and specifically, the possibility of an Iranian attack on Israel.
And not just any attack. We're talking about a potential ballistic missile attack, with some intelligence reports even using the word imminent.
That's right. CNN is really raising the alarm bells with their latest report, citing a senior White House official who used that very word imminent. It definitely gets your attention.
No kidding. And it's particularly concerning because they're drawing parallels to the attack back in April when Iran launched over 24 ballistic missiles. Most of them missed their targets, thankfully, but the potential for devastation was, and still is, enormous.
Right, and they're saying this attack could be similar in scope and scale. So before we get too far, could you unpack that for us a bit? What does similar in scope and scale actually mean?
Well, it's difficult to say with absolute certainty. Intelligence reports, never an exact science. But if we're talking about a similar number of missiles, even if some miss their targets, you're still talking about potentially massive damage.
Okay, so walk us through that. What are we talking about here?
Well, ballistic missiles can carry huge payloads. We could be talking conventional warheads, cluster munitions, you name it, all designed to inflict as much damage as possible.
And where are these missiles aimed?
That's the big question.
And Ben Wiedemann, CNN's correspondent in the region, is saying that it already feels like a regional war, in a sense, has begun.
He's not wrong to say that. And here's another thing to keep in mind. The international community's response to the April attack was fairly muted. Iran might see that as a green light, a sign that they can get away with a more aggressive approach this time.
That's a chilling thought. So you've got this potential attack looming and all the risks that come with it. But then we're also hearing reports that Iran is scrambling behind the scenes, trying to contain the potential fallout. It's like they're trying to have it both ways.
Yeah, it's a delicate game they're playing. Publicly, they're projecting strength, making it very clear that any Israeli attack will be met with retaliation. But privately, it's a different story.
So they're talking tough, but what's going on behind closed doors?
Well, sources in Tehran are saying that the regime is extremely nervous. Remember, this is a regime that thrives on projecting strength and defiance, so this nervousness is very telling.
Interesting. So the big question is, what are they so nervous about? They're the ones escalating the situation. What are they afraid of?
There are a few factors at play here. First, there's a great deal of uncertainty surrounding the U.S.'s willingness or ability to restrain Israel.
And when you say restrain, you mean?
Basically, how much will the U.S. try to prevent or limit Israel's response to an Iranian attack? And this isn't just about military strategy, it's about domestic politics on both sides.
Right, because here in the U.S. we've got an election coming up, which always adds another layer of complexity.
Exactly. And that makes it very difficult for Iran to predict how the U.S. might react.
So U.S. domestic politics, that's one factor. What else is feeding into Iran's anxiety?
Well, there's also the Hezbollah factor. They're a key Iranian ally in the region, but they've taken some serious hits from Israel recently. This weakens Iran's overall position and makes them more vulnerable.
So they're trying to project an image of strength, but behind the scenes, there's a lot of uncertainty and maybe even a little bit of fear.
That's a pretty good way to put it. They're walking a tightrope, trying to deter an Israeli attack, while simultaneously bracing for the consequences if that deterrence fails.
Fascinating and more than a little worrying. So we've got Iran seemingly itching for a fight, but also sweating bullets. What are they saying publicly, and what are they hoping to achieve with all this posturing?
Well, publicly, they're sending a very clear message that any new Israeli attack will be met with retaliation. They're really trying to lay down a marker and show that they are not backing down.
And it's worth noting that this information is coming directly from a source within Tehran, so this isn't just some anonymous tip or speculation. This is coming straight from the inside. But here's the thing. While they're making these very bold pronouncements, at the same time, they're also working the phones like crazy. They're engaging in these, what some are calling urgent diplomatic efforts. So what's the strategy there? Seems a little contradictory, doesn't it?
It does a bit, yeah. It's like they're trying to play both sides of the chessboard. On the one hand, they want to project strength, try to deter Israel from retaliating in the first place. But on the other hand, they also seem very concerned about what an Israeli counterstrike might look like, especially if they think that the U.S. won't or even can't restrain Israel.
So kind of a two-pronged approach.
Wow.
Deter and then try to mitigate.
Yeah, exactly. And the really interesting part, at least to me, is who they're talking to. They're reaching out to countries all throughout the Middle East, kind of trying to build support or at least understanding. It's like they know they probably can't stop an Israeli retaliation altogether. So instead, they're trying to maybe limit the scope or make sure that it doesn't spiral into this huge regional conflict.
Yeah, it seems like they're really trying to walk a tightrope here. But let's switch gears for a second and talk about the other side of all this, Israel. They've made it very clear that they're not going to let that October 1st attack go unanswered, and their rhetoric has been, well, pretty heated.
Yeah, heated might be an understatement. Their defense minister, Yoav Gallant, he's made some pretty strong statements, saying that Israel's response will be deadly, precise, and surprising. He even suggested that Iran doesn't really understand what happened and how it happened. Sounds a lot like a veiled threat to me.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that combined with the whole deadly, precise, and surprising line definitely paints a pretty unsettling picture. Doesn't sound like they're going to be turning the other cheek anytime soon. And all of this brings us to the role of the U.S. in this whole thing. It's a tricky situation, to say the least.
That's for sure. They're trying to walk this really, really fine line, urging restraint on the one hand, while also reaffirming their support for Israel's security. It's a tough balancing act to pull off.
So what does that actually look like? How are they trying to manage this situation in a practical sense?
Well, a lot of diplomacy, it seems. There have been tons of high-level phone calls. Biden and Netanyahu, Austin and Gallant, you name it. The message from the U.S. seems pretty clear. They're saying any retaliation needs to be proportionate, focused on military targets, trying to avoid civilian casualties at all costs. And they're also strongly urging Israel to avoid hitting things like oil and gas infrastructure. And of course, anything nuclear is totally off the table.
Right, because that would just take things to a whole other level, and nobody wants to see that.
Exactly. So the U.S. is in this really tough spot. They're trying to balance their commitment to Israel with the very real need to stop this from blowing up into something much, much bigger. The question is, how much influence do they really have? It's hard to say.
It is, and it's kind of a scary question to think about. What happens if Israel just ignores the U.S. and launches a massive retaliation strike? What then?
Well, it definitely wouldn't be good. I mean, for starters, it would be a pretty big blow to U.S. credibility on the world stage. Other countries would start to question if the U.S. is really in control or if they're willing to stand up to their allies when it counts. And you can bet that countries like Iran would see that as a sign of weakness. And on top of that, it would definitely put a strain on the U.S.-Israel relationship.
And that's not even considering the possibility of an even bigger conflict. If this escalates further, we could be talking about a regional war that pulls in not just Iran and Israel, but Hezbollah, Hamas, you name it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the human cost. I mean, war in the Middle East would be devastating, plain and simple. You'd see massive displacement, suffering, loss of life. And that's not even thinking about the long-term consequences, the trauma, the economic devastation. It's a really grim picture.
It's terrifying, really. And it's not just about these major players that we've been talking about, right? You mentioned the risk of other countries getting pulled into the conflict. What about the Gulf states? They've been pretty quiet so far, haven't they?
Yeah, quiet, but not completely inactive. They're definitely trying to stay out of the direct line of fire. But they've also made it very clear that they will not tolerate any of this spilling over into their backyard. In fact, they've drawn a line in the sand when it comes to their airspace.
What do you mean?
Basically, they've said flat out that they won't allow Israel to use their airspace for any kind of strike against Iran.
Interesting. So it sounds like they're trying to limit Israel's military options while also maybe sending a message to Iran that they're not getting a free pass here. It's like this delicate balancing act, trying to protect their own interests without getting dragged into a war that they really don't want.
Which brings up a big question. Is there anyone out there who can actually de-escalate the situation? Or are we just along for the ride?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Who can actually put a stop to this before it's too late?
It's tough to say. Right now, it feels like everything's just spiraling further and further out of control. Everyone's making these calculated moves, but the risks are huge, and one wrong step could have devastating consequences. It really could. It's like we're at a stalemate, where no one's willing to back down, and every action just leads to another reaction. It's a recipe for disaster, really.
And it's easy to feel powerless, like we're just watching all of this unfold from a distance and there's nothing we can do about it. But we're talking about real people's lives here.
Exactly. We can't forget about that human cost. Even if it's a limited war, even if it doesn't turn into this huge regional conflict, it's still going to be devastating for the people caught in the middle. Families torn apart, homes destroyed, lives lost. And the long-term effects, the trauma, the economic fallout, all of it. It's heartbreaking.
It really is. But as bad as things look right now, I do think there's still hope. Diplomacy might be a long shot, but those efforts are still ongoing. And we've got countries like the Gulf states who are clearly invested in making sure this doesn't turn into a bigger war. They might be the key to finding a way out of this mess.
Yeah, they might. They have a unique position here because they can apply pressure on both sides. They can remind Israel that their patience isn't unlimited and that they'll face consequences if they act recklessly. And on the other side, they can let Iran know that the international community won't tolerate any more aggression. It's a long shot, for sure, but sometimes that's all you need.
That little glimmer of hope can make all the difference. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the possibility of imminent attacks, the behind-the-scenes diplomacy, the precarious position of the U.S., and of course, the human cost of all of this. One thing that really struck me throughout all of this is just how complex it all really is. There's so many moving parts, so many different countries with their own goals and their own strategies. It's a good reminder, I think, that we live in a very interconnected world, and what happens in one part of the world can have huge ripple effects everywhere else.
It's true. And it just underscores the importance of staying informed. Looking beyond the headlines and trying to understand all sides of the story. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, but knowledge is power, especially when it feels like the stakes are this high.
I like that knowledge is power. And to our listeners, as always, we encourage you to keep digging deeper, keep asking those tough questions. We've only scratched the surface here today. Here's something else to think about. We've been focusing on the main players here: Iran, Israel, the U.S. But what about the role of international organizations, like the UN, for example? Do they have a role to play in all of this? Could they help mediate the situation, open up a dialogue, maybe even help find a peaceful solution? Or are they, as some critics would argue, basically powerless to act in situations like this? It's a question worth considering. That's what we do here at the Deep Dive. We ask the tough questions, explore the complexities, and hopefully come away with a deeper understanding of our world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.